Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Deern, and I'm a senior lecturer in entrepreneurship at Goldsmiths, which is part of the University of London. And I do research on entrepreneurship in times of crisis. In particular, I look at crisis management and resilience. And in this series, Ben Gillam, the CEO and founder of ThirdWay, and myself and many others wanted to bring together our communities of interest. We wanted to share knowledge and understanding around both practice and research in order to help individuals, in particular business owners, CEOs, managers, and entrepreneurs, to navigate this difficult time. So we're focusing on the COVID-19 pandemic, but not exclusively. So in this, our second session on decision-making and planning in times of uncertainty, we did a live recorded webinar. And during that time, in the first few minutes, we had our own little technical error or mishap, which meant that the first few minutes was lost. And as a result, instead of re-record the entire session, we thought it would be best if I just covered those few minutes lost, and then we would patch through to the main discussion with Ben. So that's what I'd like to do with you now. So to begin, one of the biggest challenges that we all face at the moment during the current COVID-19 pandemic is this high level of uncertainty and volatility in the environment and how best to make decisions in this context. So it's really hard for all of us to visualize what's going to happen next. So what's going to happen over the next few weeks or months, and of course over the next year or two. And uncertainty tends to really exist, not to oversimplify, but it tends to exist when the amount of information we need and the amount of information we have access to is not aligned. And this really helps to explain that why in the first few weeks of the crisis of the current COVID-19 pandemic, that we're all paying attention to the latest press briefing and looking to the media, but also looking within our organizations for answers. And even if the answers we get are not always good or positive for us, or our businesses, it still helps to alleviate some of the anxiety that we experience in relation to that uncertainty. And if anything, it helps us to flag up the need to explore alternatives. So when uncertainty is high, it's also the case that entrepreneurs are prone to making decisions on the basis of intuition, so their gut instinct, but also on emotions and what we refer to as heuristics or mental shortcuts or rules of thumb. But these are not necessarily the best or most helpful strategies to evoke. So entrepreneurs can avoid some of these pitfalls in decision-making by doing the following. First of all, they can be aware of what's known as affect infusion. So this is some terminology that was coined by psychologists. But the view here is that affect, which includes moods and emotions, so moods being longer term enduring feelings of pleasure or displeasure, and emotions being short-term reactions to things we find meaningful in our environments. So our feelings of happiness, sadness, anger, and so on. These are in relation to something. But these feelings can color our thoughts and in turn our decision-making in certain contexts when uncertainty is high, but also when we are faced with a lot of novelty. So when a situation is new. When decisions come to us more automatically, that our feelings have less sway over our thoughts. So for instance, let's say you're a vegetarian and you've been a vegetarian for 20 years or so. How you're feeling, whether it's good or bad, will not necessarily impact on your decision around what to eat. So you won't opt for the steak over a salad because of it. But if you're making a decision for the first time, and again, there's a lot of uncertainty, so you have to decide how to pivot your organization, or you need to decide whether or not to hire or fire a senior member of staff, then your moods, your emotions can color your decision making. And so it's something to be aware of. So the second thing that entrepreneurs can do to avoid some of the pitfalls of decision making is to avoid quick fixes. So in order to reduce uncertainty, people often employ what's known as heuristics. So this is just a fancy word to capture what is meant by mental shortcuts or rules of thumb or best practices or even common sense when it comes to decision making. So they might revert to things they've done in the past that have worked well. They might revert to, for instance, going to the same individual or mentor or industry leader or even the person in their family who they rely on for advice. But in the current situation, in the pandemic, that may not necessarily be the best way to go. And we also might make decisions on the basis of how quickly information comes to us. So that's known as the availability heuristic. Or we might make decisions on the basis of our mental models or prototypes of what a good decision or bad decision might look like. And that's the representativeness heuristic. So let me give you an example. So let's say I'm on holiday. Wouldn't that be nice? And I'm on holiday with a group of friends, and we rent a motorboat, and we're out on the water. And one of my friends stops the boat and says, "Let's go swimming." So for me, the first thing that might come to mind is that if I go swimming, I'll be eaten by sharks, because I saw the film Jaws at a young and impressionable age. So what heuristics help us to do is they help us to make decisions quickly. But of course, in that situation, it really depends on where we are in the world. It depends on the kind of water. It depends on how deep the water is, and so on and so forth, many other things as well. And as a result, I'm making a decision, I'm doing so quickly, but I'm not necessarily making the right decision. So I might be overestimating or even underestimating the risks involved and drawing the wrong conclusions as a result. So in order to avoid these pitfalls, to avoid affect infusion, and to avoid these quick fixes, what we really need to be doing now during a period of uncertainty is to be stepping back and taking a more systematic approach to decision making. So this might involve taking a less quick, less immediate approach to decision making. So collecting more information, drawing meaningful comparisons. And I think a lot of people I've spoken to over the last little while, a lot of entrepreneurs have been doing this. So they have been following government guidance. They have been speaking to people within their industry or beyond. They have been looking at what people in other contexts, in other countries have been doing. And they have been lobbying for more support, and they have been watching webinars and reading a lot as well. So this kind of systematic approach is really needed. And there are also a number of steps that entrepreneurs can follow to be more systematic in their decision making and avoid the pitfalls that I mentioned earlier. So firstly, they can identify or hone in on a particular problem or problems, but I think it's good to focus on one at a time. So what is the problem exactly that we're dealing with? Is it that because of the current COVID-19 crisis, that and due to social distancing, that our capacity has been reduced and our desired sales doesn't meet up with our actual sales? And so that's the problem. And then in the second stage, it would be all about, well, what are the different courses of action or possible solutions that we could put into place to resolve that problem? And it's at this stage where entrepreneurs really need to engage in creative brainstorming. So they need to be thinking about all of the different alternatives. And what your mind will want to do is to rush to judgment quickly. Your mind will want to come up with a solution very quickly, or other people might pressure you to do so. So these are the kinds of decisions you have to make over several sittings. And I think that's important. And in the third stage, you would need to be thinking about, well, what are your main objectives generally? Like, what are you trying to accomplish in your business over the next few months or the next year, and to articulate those. And fourthly, you need to be thinking about how the different courses of action that you come up with in stage 2, and hopefully within that, there's an optimal course of action you can follow, how that course of action will help you to address the problem at hand and to meet the desired objectives and goals. So these are just some of the strategies that entrepreneurs can use to make better decisions in a context of uncertainty. And now we'll go to the main discussion with Ben. Thank you. How have things been going for you in terms of the last few weeks or so in relation to making decisions? What kinds of decisions have you had to make? Have you observed some of these pitfalls, and what kinds of feelings are you getting from other people that you're working with in this regard?
I think I've experienced all of them. And, like as you were talking, sort of the two things that sort of were really like resonating with me were the emotional aspect. I think I touched on last week, that seesaw of emotion. And also like getting the balance right between trusting your intuition and your knowledge of your company, your knowledge of your industry, but also not jumping and committing fully to just that, and actually like backing it up with sound reasoning and sort of going outside your bubble and trying to be objective about it. I think for us, decision making, what it really came down to was stepping back from what we were in and sort of taking a real objective look at it. And again, I feel like there's this sense of, as a business owner, you're like, are we in crisis? Are we not? Like, what does this all mean? Actually stepping back and saying, well, what's actually going on in the world? Like, what is the pandemic crisis? What is the, it's all released. Like, what's the scientific evidence of the curve, and how long we're likely to be in lockdown, and when we sort of should be in a position where people can come back out. It does exist out there. there's tons of information about how businesses have gone through crisis before, like what's out there, how have people responded before, what's proved to be a successful recipe, what's proved to be a recipe for failure, and looking at those pieces, and then coming back to the problem, or actually then coming back to your company. Funny enough, you start to see the problems, you start to be able to articulate the problems, which gives you a really good chance to actually talk about the right things and plan for the right things. So sorry, it's a bit of a jumbled answer, but I think that's kind of the nature of what's going on. There's so much going on. And you know, I found your point interesting about you can look out there and there is news, even if it's sort of not the news you want. I think one of the problems is for business owners is there's just so much noise. There is so much noise, and you know, if you go onto a business social media platform, it can be one of the worst places to be, because I suppose we're in that sensationalist culture now, and a lot of businesses are sort of putting out all these sort of sensational predictions about what the future looks like and how they are so forward thinking and have the right solutions, that actually that can confuse the situation. And yeah, just the ability to step away from all of that and just like focus on the problems at hand, I found really to be key. Yeah, I think for us, it's asking the question, is our industry going to fundamentally change as a result of the pandemic? So we create office space for companies to use, for human beings to use. And there are tried and tested ratios of how much space you give to an individual. Now, they've kind of been thrown out the window with social distancing. So what does that mean in the immediate? What does that mean for the next 6 months? And what does that mean for the future? Is there going to be any real fundamental lasting change? This new normal that we keep hearing about that no one wants to define. What do these things really mean? Because what they mean can have a major impact upon the demand for space from our clientele, how we design space, so how we then have to upskill our team, how we procure space, how we deliver space, the timings it takes. So like those are really sort of technical questions that fundamentally underpin what we do as a business. And we've had to make decisions, like quick decisions about those, and start to plan for sort of what the long-term decisions might be if there are long-term changes.
Exactly. Thank you. And something Ben and I have been talking about quite a lot is scenario planning. So I think in times of uncertainty and with regards to making decisions in this context, this uncertain context, scenario planning is quite a useful tool to adopt. And I thought maybe I'd say a few words about that and what we mean by it exactly, and how all businesses, including small businesses, can effectively utilize it. So scenario planning is something that was first used by the military and then later adopted by other kinds of organizations from the 1960s onwards. And really what it does is it tries to tell a story of how different elements interact under certain conditions. So it can help all businesses think about the different kinds of possibilities and prepare them for different eventualities in an open and flexible fashion. So what that means is essentially that these kinds of scenarios can and should be revisited over time. They're not necessarily concrete, they're evolving. And scenario planning is a little bit different from contingency planning to the extent that while both deal with uncertainty, that contingency planning is more about dealing with one specific uncertainty. Whereas if you think about what's happening now with the pandemic, we're dealing with many uncertainties at the same time. So I think that's why scenario planning is particularly useful in this context. So in terms of how people can start to engage in scenario planning and do so effectively, I think one of the first things that we need to all do perhaps is to think about what's going on in the external environment in relation to the pandemic, and think about the best and worst case scenarios, and then how these scenarios and different iterations thereof interact ultimately with the business in terms of how they might change or impact on the business focus, the business model. So in terms of how you deliver value to your customers, your cost structures, your revenue streams, but also in terms of your job roles and tasks. So to what extent might these things be affected? So if we think about what's happening right now with the pandemic, we can say, well, there's lots of best and worst case scenarios, right? So best case scenario, infection rates go down or wiped out completely. Worst case scenario, infection rates go up. And then there are other variations thereof as well. Worst case scenario, there are several peaks, further peaks down the road, or this is it. That's the best case scenario. And testing might improve and be effective, or testing might be ineffective. There's a vaccine, there's no vaccine, the lockdown ends, the lockdown is extended, there are other subsequent lockdowns, or it might have to do with legislation around social distancing. So that legislation might relax, it might become more intense. Government funding might increase or be extended, or it might be withdrawn. And then, of course, there's the economy. So we know that an economic recession is very likely. Will it turn into a depression, or will the economy actually be much more resilient and buoyant than imagined? So we need to think about all these different possibilities, and as I mentioned, different iterations thereof, and then think about how the business might fare, as I alluded to, in relation to the focus, the business model, job roles, job tasks, etc. So given what's happening in the external environment, and thinking about one sector and thinking about one size and focus and other factors, we might imagine, for instance, 4 crude scenarios at this point in time. And Ben and I have talked about this in the past as well. So the first scenario might be that everything goes for your company, everything might go back to normal. So it's business as usual, or returns to normal fairly quickly. And we know that some businesses are in this situation, or are in fact even growing right now. So those businesses that have a history of working remotely, working in their e-commerce sphere, I think that's the case for some of those. Second scenario is the opposite to an extent, that you go back to work, but to an entirely new kind of usual. So, or a new normal or new abnormal, effectively. So we know that some sectors are more at risk for this, or might even slip into what I'll describe as the 4th scenario, which is ultimate closure. So we might see that businesses in the travel and leisure services have to do entirely new things, which might have severe impacts on their focus, their business models, job roles and tasks, and so on. And then there's the 3rd scenario, where I find I'm situated. So academia, universities are situated, which is a hybrid model. So we see a mix of the old and the new, to the extent that there's going to be more online teaching mixed with offline teaching, with social distancing. And then we see a lot of other companies as well, mixing a bit of the old with the new. So some companies are pivoting. So we know that there's a lot of famous examples in the UK of pubs and bottle shops turning into grocery stores, click and collect groceries. There are examples famously of breweries and distilleries making hand sanitizers. There's examples of toiletries companies making disinfectants, or garment companies making masks and gowns, as well as the other things they were doing. And then we have the 4th scenario that I mentioned, which is that for some businesses in some sectors, that they don't go back at all. So people lose their jobs, businesses close, and it's hard to say who will fall into this category exactly. So we know that some industries are at risk, as I mentioned, travel, leisure, but also hospitality and otherwise, possibly even large and small retailers who are finding it very difficult to make that shift into the online space as well. So this is the time where we all need to be thinking about this as well. What if I lose my job? What if the business closes? Then what? Does that mean a new career for me? Does that mean new business opportunities? And what might those opportunities be exactly? So because there's this surge in online sales, maybe there's more companies and more services around that to accommodate that, new forums. Maybe there are more services and products around health and safety and sanitation, social distancing. So we're seeing some of that now. And maybe as we all shift, or a lot of us shift to remote working, that there are more products and services around how to connect with others and flexible working tools and the like. So I think there are a lot of different examples of where companies might find themselves. And again, I think it's important that we all try to anticipate and think about and imagine in each of these scenarios what might happen to the business and what might happen to us as individuals, and how we can put some things down now on paper to better prepare and to keep revisiting such. So I don't know, Ben.
I got to say, like, this was key to us in our scenario planning. Again, when we objectively looked at these categories of business, and they're the type of business that come out of a crisis, it really enabled us to identify who we were. And as soon as we could identify who we were, and we are a hybrid business in those categories you said, like, we will unquestionably launch new ventures and new product lines to serve the new market we're going into, which naturally means that some of the previous products we had might not be market relevant, and we need to redeploy resource, redeploy people, and contract those services. As soon as that became crystallized in our mind, we could plan everything. We could start thinking about budgets, we could start thinking about resource, we could start applying the same criteria to who our clients are and put a robustness score against them and who we could build our business model around. And what we also found was it gave us a great sounding board to actually go to our clients with and say, you know, a lot of our clients were, and we get to speak to CEOs and other business leaders, didn't really know what to do. But you could put them into three brackets. You had the big corporate that was sort of say 400 or 500 people plus business. They didn't know what to do, but they had enough capital to just spend. So they could almost take the view, well, hey, we'll spend £1 million modifying our space. If we have to rip it out in 6 months' time, we can live with that, we go again. Didn't know what to do, but just acted. Then you have the small businesses, maybe 30, 40 people and less, who were taking the view, we don't know what to do, we don't know what business we're going to be, but we're only 30, 40 people, we can be quite nimble, that we'll make the decision in 2 months' time when we have a bit more clarity on how that pans out, which I actually think is a mistake. I think these are things you can objectively plan for and get yourself ahead of the game so that when the market comes back online, you're not being crippled then by what we do with our office and our space and our people. But say our core business, which is businesses of 50 to 250, 300 people, what we really found was that people were crippled by fear. It was, we don't have tons of capital to waste on quick modifications, and we're not nimble enough to just disperse the home. Like, what do we do? And just got caught in this like real bracket of not knowing how to scenario plan for their office and for their people, and therefore deploy their capital. And being able to distill this to them and say, well, look, what type of business do you think you're going to be? And most of our clients fall into that business as usual. They're either hibernating and will come back, or actually the crisis might be lending itself to their business line and their offering, or they're hybrids, like they're going to do some of what they did and something new, has enabled them as well to make plans about their office and deployment. For us, coming back to ThirdWay, it just, all of our financial planning, all of our resilience planning, all of our people planning came off of the back of recognizing what type of business we were coming out of the crisis. So any CEO, business owner, leader out there, I would say this is a great starting position or something to revisit with your planning.
Sounds good. And we have a couple of questions. So Ben.
That's a really good question. I think there is, I got accused last week, by the way, of sitting on the fence, of giving a politician's answer for a question. So I'm going to try and be more decisive. The toughest decision so far, there's emotional tough, which for me is probably the toughest. The emotional tough was all around the furloughing of staff. That unquestionably, we asked staff to take pay cuts, we asked people to go on furlough, and that was all about the scenario planning. It was all saying we need to create the longest possible runway so that we can outmap the path of the virus and the impact it will have on the economy. So that was unquestionably tough because you're dealing with people, and I deliberately made sure that I did some of those interviews or furlough meetings myself. So like I wasn't immune from the emotional challenge of it because knowing what our managers had to go through. So that was really, really tough. In terms of toughest business decision, if you sort of objectively had to look at it, it's definitely the deployment of capital. It was being brave to say, I do believe the market is going to change based upon the trends that were already happening, based upon the economic situation that shows me that certain business models aren't resilient within our industry, based upon client feedback and sentiment that I've been collecting and my own personal convictions for the market, to turn around to the management team and my business partners and say, we are going to spend significant amounts of money in the next few weeks in the most fraught market any of us might ever know, because I believe this is what the business needs to do for the future. It was that. So that was a tough business decision because of the amount to deploy, but it wasn't tough because I felt the scenario planning process we went through gave me great conviction that it was the right decision. So I hope that's not sitting on the fence. I look forward to abuse afterwards if it is.
And we have another question as well. I can see how
I think clarity is key. You can, particularly when you're all on site together, and I've definitely been guilty of this in the past, you can give like 80% of a message and let the environment and the dynamic of a meeting like set the tone for the other 20%. I don't believe managers should necessarily be going to the team who are delivering technical work and ask them to overthink about scenario planning. I think that is the job of the manager and the leadership team to ask those questions. And then when it comes down to the team, and they're vital team members, it doesn't diminish them in any way, who are executing. Our job is to give them complete clarity on the execution and then receive their feedback on how they're finding the execution to modify the planning and the scenarios. So I think it's just about clear lines of communication, clear roles and responsibilities, and just defining that and being open to the feedback loop.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about well-being and leadership and resilience. So I think some of the themes that Ben mentioned today in terms of some of the tough decisions around staff will come out more next week, and how best to ensure and enhance the well-being of staff, as well as oneself as an entrepreneur. What people can do over the next little while to be more effective and take care of themselves ultimately. So thank you very much. And hopefully we'll see you all again soon.
Thanks, everyone.